Good evening. Welcome to Left, Right and Centre. What a day it's been. Our Olympic stars back in the country. Celebrations big time from the airport right to a hotel in the heart of the city. They were honoured and they've spoken. We're going to bring you the excerpts of that in a little while from now. But we've got another couple of important themes which we're going to focus on. The issue is of vaccination and vaccine passports, and the question so many are asking right now, particularly students and others. Vaccinated in India, rejected abroad. Why are many nations now shunning Indian vaccines? You would have heard about this in the United Kingdom. You would have heard about this as the EU as a collective not accepting an Indian series of vaccines or the COVID umbrella for Covishield and Covaxin. They've not accepted it. Individual countries have. And that creates all sorts of problems. Then there are reports of how even vaccines which are identical, Covishield, not accepted, even if they are administered in the UK, which some batches have. So people in the UK have actually on some occasions been given Covishield manufactured in India, and then when they went to travel, based on that batch number, they were told, no, that's not acceptable. Why? Why is that the case? That makes absolutely no sense. And now very strong reports that the United Arab Emirates as well, while not rejecting Covishield, have actually said that they prioritize their internal vaccination program first before accepting drugs like Covishield. But their internal vaccination program accepts AstraZeneca, then why aren't they accepting Covishield from the onset? That's what a lot of people from the United Arab Emirates or who reside in the United Arab Emirates are asking. They're stuck in India, they want to go back home, and they're facing this problem. We'll bring you case studies on this program. Also, a new report warns of a catastrophic impact of climate change. It's the new IPCC report. Is the globe on a tipping point? A 1.5 degree rise in temperatures around the globe taking place by 2030 is projected. What does that mean for us? But first, let's bring you the really positive stories, the fantastic news of our sensational athletes returning from the Olympics.
एनडीटीवी ने सबसे आगे आपको दिया।
चाहूंगा कि आप सभी ने कवर किया।
नीरज, क्या एनडीटीवी को कुछ क्या कहना चाहेंगे सबसे ज्यादा जो आपके लिए हमेशा
जो दर्शक देख रहे हैं?
कितनी मुश्किल हुई थी नीरज जी, कितनी मुश्किल हुई थी वहाँ पे?
कहाँ पे जी?
वहाँ पे खेलते टाइम।
एनडी का धन्यवाद जो इतना प्यार और सम्मान दिया है देश में आने के बाद। ऐसा लग रहा है जैसे दोबारा से मेडल जीता।
सर, सबसे बड़ी क्या क्या चुनौतियाँ ऐसी रहेंगी और कितना क्या थोड़ा सा डर था कि पूरा देश देख रहा है अभी हमारे पास कब मेडल्स आए?
नहीं, बिल्कुल भी डर नहीं था। बस दिक्कत ये थी, मेरे को 1 महीने पहले चोट लग गई थी और उसी के कारण था। बस वही थोड़े मूवमेंट भी हो रहे थे। मैं अपनी परफॉर्मेंस से ये नहीं था कि मैं डर रहा, मुझे ये इंजरी का था, मूवमेंट अच्छे से नहीं हो रहे थे।
बस देश में सिल्वर मेडल जीता तो ये कितनी बड़ी उपलब्धि आपके लिए? सबसे बड़ा कितना बड़ी उपलब्धि? क्या कहना चाहिए? हमेशा उपलब्धि है। रवि भाई कैसा लगा?
जी बिल्कुल, मुझे लगता है कि ये प्रॉब्लम सभी जितने भी खिलाड़ी यहाँ पे बैठे हैं लगभग सभी मिडिल क्लास फैमिली से हैं और सभी को ये प्रॉब्लम आती है। लेकिन मैं बोलता हूँ कि उनकी फैमिली का सबसे बड़ा हाथ होता है कि वो पैसे से चाहे उनको सपोर्ट नहीं कर सकते, लेकिन वो जब ये बोलते हैं ना कि तुम बस खेलो, कोई बात नहीं, रिजल्ट देखा जाएगा, तो वो बहुत जरूरी होता है। और मुझे लगता है कि वो जो एक स्ट्रगल होता है और वो जो कमी होती है पैसों की भी या स्टेडियम की, वो कहीं ना कहीं एक एथलीट में आग पैदा करती है कि हाँ हमारे पास इस चीज की कमी है और हमें मेहनत करके इसको पूरा करना है।
All right, well, we're going to move on now to our first debate. Vaccinated in India, rejected abroad. Why are many nations shunning Indian vaccines? You would have heard the entire debate about vaccine passports, how the European Union, through their medical body, have actually said that a certain set of vaccines, if they are included in the European Union's vaccine passport, can apply for people from the EU traveling all around the region. You don't need to quarantine, nothing of the sort. But the problem emerges when countries like India and our nationals travel abroad and our vaccines, even though they may be the same. Remember, Covishield is the AstraZeneca vaccine. That's not accepted elsewhere. In the case, for example, of the United Kingdom, we've got students going over there, fully vaccinated. They need to quarantine, but UK nationals who've had the same vaccine don't need to, and those in the European Union who've had the identical vaccine, it's called Vaxzevria, can actually go to the UK and study, and they don't need to quarantine either. So it's the same drug, different standards. And there are problems which are also happening with the United Arab Emirates right now. Well, joining us now, Dr. Mohammed Rafiq, the medical director. He's a pulmonologist and chair of infection control at Prime Hospital in Dubai. And we've got another guest as well joining us, Sanam Arora, founder and chairperson of the National Indian Students and Alumni Union of the United Kingdom. We've got an MP with us, Virendra Sharma. He's an MP in the United Kingdom, chair of the All-Party Parliamentary Group on India. Very, very influential over there. Good to have you back on this program. But I'm going to look first at the United Arab Emirates situation. And Dr. Rafiq, does it at all make sense that Indian nationals who have residency rights in the United Arab Emirates but have been vaccinated in India because they were stuck over here can't easily go back to the UAE, to Dubai, for example?
Hi. I think the health authorities have clarified that the Covishield, the equivalent form, that is of the Oxford AstraZeneca, is in the approved list for flying to the countries, apart from the other vaccines like Pfizer, Sinopharm, and Sputnik.
They have said that AstraZeneca, as long as it is injected, given in the United Arab Emirates, works. If you've got it elsewhere, there are passengers who've been told, for example, by the airlines, that getting on to their flights to go back to the United Arab Emirates is problematic, at least in the initial stage.
Maybe in the initial stage, I'm not sure. But at this point, I think we have people flying in from India. And I think recently the flights have opened up, and people who have taken Covishield.
Okay, Dr. Rafiq, just one moment. We are joined by Khalilur Rahman. He is a husband. He's here in India. His wife is in Dubai. Mr. Rahman, what is the problem that you encountered when you tried to go to the United Arab Emirates?
Right. I have come to India the previous March. Actually, I had come for an emergency, and unfortunately, I have been stuck in India. And recently, it is a good news that the flight had been opened. But initially, from August 5th, the flights had opened on August 5th, and at that moment, the news that we heard was the government of UAE would not accept the vaccinations for the visitors to UAE from India who had taken the vaccination from any other country besides UAE. So that had been a bit of a letdown, and it had just created more uncertainty, because even some of my friends had taken a ticket a few days back and they could not go back to UAE. Myself, I had taken a ticket for the 19th this month, and there is a bit of a good news. It seems that we can now take the flight to UAE with the Covishield vaccination that is being provided over here.
All right, so that's absolutely great news. But the fact is, there was confusion earlier on, and the question that a lot of people would ask is, why would that take place in the first place? But I want to go across to Mr. Virendra Sharma over there, who joins us at this stage. Sir, there's nothing in terms of progress as far as getting Indian nationals off quarantine in the United Kingdom, those who've come fully vaccinated. Isn't that problematic still?
Thank you very much. But let me first congratulate India and all their participants in the
Olympics.
Tokyo and Olympics, and come back having gold and other awards. But certainly the morale is very high amongst the diaspora as well. They are very happy that India has achieved so many golds and other silver points on that. I am concerned, as many other people are concerned, the way the whole debate is taking place and where the people are still suffering. I personally, I'm not a scientist, I'm a political activist. I will pick up the issues when the communities are rising on that. I will definitely ask the Indian government to start the ball rolling and asking the other experts in the field to question the countries who are refusing to take it. I can assure you one thing, as political activists, once the Indian government and the other institutions start the debate and demand the review of the situation, I will definitely back those bodies who are interested and who wanted to make a change.
All right. Now, Sanam, how has this been affecting Indian students trying to get to the United Kingdom, for the benefit of viewers who perhaps have not seen our earlier program?
So I think, Vishnu, thanks for having me again. Based on all the sort of advocacy we've done and through your support, raising this issue again and again, I think that has moved the dial. And of course, India has now moved from the red list into the amber list. Currently, however, what being on the amber list means is, although you don't have to pay the £1,750 and do a mandatory 10-day hotel-managed, government-managed quarantine, you still need to quarantine for 10 days. So the question a lot of students are asking is, why is it the case that an identical vaccine from Europe or from the US or any other countries is actually being allowed, even though those countries are on the amber list, people coming from those countries don't have to quarantine for the 10-day period, whereas those who are double jabbed coming from India on the Covishield vaccine in particular are now not being allowed to be exempt from that quarantine. And so that's one thing. And in fact, yesterday we had a session with a couple of hundred prospective and current Indian students who are looking to come back from India to the UK. And they were also asking about the sort of, they're quite confused about what happens if India suddenly moves into the red list again, because every 3 weeks there is a review in the UK, which is of course necessary. But there's this aspect of being confused about how long ahead of our course start date can we come. There's all sorts of mathematical modeling going on about when should we book our sort of flights versus when should we book our visas. So I think there is an unnecessary amount of confusion amongst the student community. And I think what would be really helpful is if, universities and the British government provided some clarity on the sort of point by point, step-by-step process to them of coming over, because the anxiety is just really, really high. And while, everybody has rejoiced and welcomed India moving off the red list into the amber list, a lot of these confusions and uncertainties still remain. So I think clarification, which has been an issue throughout, I think, throughout this sort of supply chain, end-to-end supply chain, of whether it's, various governments to airlines to airports to sort of universities, etc. In my observation, that end-to-end chain has not been clear at all, and that problem a year and a half later still continues.
In fact, so what Khalil was telling us in a different context, in the context of the United Arab Emirates, is that for all these days there was confusion. He felt that he couldn't travel actually to the UAE, and now he's told that no, you can. We finally understood that perhaps the language was poorly stated. So Khalil, is that what happened in your case? That on the 19th you can board a flight, earlier you couldn't because they wouldn't accept Covishield?
Even now presently I did hear the news. I got this idea that we could travel from the Emirates airlines, but still there's a bit of uncertainty, because it had been, this go ahead was given some time back. It had come in the news also before, and still it was backtracked. And there's still actually a 20% confusion in my mind, because I have gone through so much uncertainties in the past few months. We are just hoping for the best. Like when August 19th, my date to board the flight comes, that I could really go. We're still having my fingers crossed, because that was the amount of confusion and uncertainty that I had to
Khalil,
go through.
we've also spoken to Emirates.
There had been a lot of law.
Emirates is at one stage at least, I don't know if it still is, the largest international carrier out leaving India. And so this morning when we spoke to their help desk, and we are not suggesting that this is the last word, because evidently there's a lot of confusion, they say you can only travel to the UAE if you have a Dubai residence visa and if you have got vaccine shots in Dubai, right? And that is what is deeply problematic. If it's a problem of communication or language, then that needs to be fixed as well. Dr. Rafiq, would you agree that this sort of confusion doesn't help anything?
Well, I'm not sure on whether what you're mentioning, whether it needs to be vaccinated in Dubai. That part, I'm not sure on that, but I'm sure with the health regulatories and the travel arrangements which they have with the airline industry, which keeps on changing, probably I think you should look for updates and more clarity on this. As we see people coming in from India with this vaccine which we mentioned, and I think the flights just opened up a few days before. Maybe initially the flights were not happening, but recently we see a lot of people coming in. So probably you should be looking in for updates and be in touch with the health authorities. And as you rightly mentioned, Khalil, the health authorities have in fact approved this Covishield for travel purposes sometime before. But then once again, it is to do with, the local.
And yet there are multiple news articles out of the United Arab Emirates pointing out, in some of the cases, language saying that it's been confusing and it's difficult. So let me, for example, give you an example of how that confusion helps no one. This is thenationalnews.com, and what they've actually been saying is that people who were immunized in India, Pakistan, Nepal, Sri Lanka, Uganda or Nigeria are not eligible to return at this time regardless of which vaccine they took. This is a dateline yesterday. Now, they are quoting a government report which last week said all passengers with a valid UAE residence visa who have been fully vaccinated in the UAE and who hold an official vaccination certificate issued and approved by relevant authorities in the UAE are permitted to return to the UAE, right? This is what Emirates Airline Support Account wrote in response to people who had taken Covishield. So there is very clear confusion over here. But let me just go across to Professor Ravindra Gupta. Professor Gupta, now there have been batches of Covishield which have actually been exported to the United Kingdom from India. And there have been instances where people in the UK who've been vaccinated with this have had trouble traveling within Europe because the batch says it was made in India and therefore it was problematic. Now, is it a problem with the quality of manufacture? Is it a problem with a vaccine passport, or that it's come from India? Where does the confusion lie?
I'm not sure exactly where the confusion lies, but of course there are concerns that are not substantiated about the quality of manufacture of certain vaccines. And I think it's up to WHO, for example, to lead on a list of vaccines that should be universally accepted.
Well, they've done that.
For travel purposes.
See, that's the confusion, Dr. Gupta. Professor Gupta, that's the problem. Many vaccines have in fact been listed by the WHO as being approved. Right? For example, Covishield fully approved. It says that in addition to AstraZeneca. And yet for entry into the United Kingdom, Indians who can travel over there now, tourists, students, whoever, still need to quarantine despite being fully vaccinated. So if the drug is identical, it's named by the World Health Organization, then why would that be the case?
Yeah, I think it's unjustified. I mean, another aspect to this is the view, and it's borne out by some data, that the levels of antibodies produced after AstraZeneca vaccination or Covishield are a little bit less than found with mRNA vaccines, and there may be a perception that people are at greater risk of breakthrough infection if they've had the Covishield vaccine. Now, there isn't any clear evidence for that, but the vaccine efficacy of AstraZeneca is a little bit lower than for Pfizer, for example, the mRNA vaccine. We have data on that from the UK, but it's not a huge difference, and we are still using the AstraZeneca vaccine in large quantities around the UK. So, that may be part of what's playing into the decision by the government.
And it also needs to be said that India's own rules are quite vague. If you go to the Delhi airport website, for example, and rules governing foreign nationals coming into India, there is mention as part of a document dated February this year that they need to stay at home for a period of 7 days. They don't use the word quarantine. In another part of the document, they say they need to be monitoring their own health. And perhaps it's not enforced in the same manner in which it is in the United Kingdom. But, it's confusion in all parts of the world. And I think this needs to be mentioned as well. There is confusion about entering India at so many levels. But Mr. Sharma, the larger point of vaccine passports. Now, the World Health Organization has said vaccine passports are in a sense entirely incorrect, because they essentially mean that a group of people from a group of countries, on the basis of the vaccines they have received, can travel where they want, whereas people in countries who are not part of that vaccine passport system cannot. Now, if you forget about India for a moment, a large batches of Covishield were used in parts of Africa, several nations in Africa. And so forget about Indian nationals, many nationals from countries in Africa face the same predicament about traveling to either the United Kingdom or parts of Europe. How is that fair?
No, we always raise these questions, and there's a huge debate taking place. There's many European countries also disagreeing with the vaccine passport policy. My party don't support that. And I think that majority people don't support that, because it is as confusing, as you said, that everybody is confused. You got the 3 websites in India giving the different type of information. So that's where the confusion is. Nobody is clear. Everybody making their own policies while they are moving on. And it is confusing the users of the services. So I personally feel that there should be an international debate on the subject to make sure that it is resolved, not rather than creating a confusion. I know the experts are here.
Sure.
I know Professor Gupta is here. I'm taking that point in the academic field, and I'm sure the others will be taking as well.
Yeah. You know, Professor Gupta, we've all been looking very closely at efficacy and safety data and all of that in mRNA vaccines versus, say, an AstraZeneca vaccine, and relative efficacy against the old variant, the Delta strain, etc., etc. But in India, we've got a drug called Covaxin. Now, it's not yet been approved by the WHO, but there is any amount of clinical data gathered on the ground saying that it works, it protects people. And yet, because it's not on the WHO list, means that, for example, a lot of students who've been double vaccinated with Covaxin, who never had a choice about the vaccine they would get in India, will not be accepted as students, for example, in the United States. They are free to travel, right? However, they are not free to go to their university with a fully vaccinated status. Is it not time for us to perhaps look at the limitations of the WHO system itself, when there is a great deal of clinical evidence in countries like India? It's a huge country, and so many students are suffering. I get emails from, on an average, 4 or 5 students every single day saying, I never picked my vaccine, I've paid all this money or whatever to go abroad, and I can't do that because my vaccine is not accepted. But everybody in India seems to say it works. I mean, your thoughts, Dr. Gupta?
I mean, with the Covaxin, I think the issue is that live attenuated virus vaccinations have been suggested to be a little bit less efficacious than other platforms, and I think that there is a bit of uncertainty as to the real world protection of attenuated or live virus vaccines. So, I mean, in my view, there probably is a greater risk of being infected by Delta if you've had a live.
Professor Gupta, with all due respect, that they have come out with phase 3 trial data. Now that needs to be peer reviewed, absolutely. But assuming for a moment that a company comes out with this peer reviewed with this phase 3 trial data, which they've submitted to the World Health Organization, it's a large company. They've got a track record of producing vaccines. Perhaps they will hit that number. It's just below 80%. So it's still. And depending on the scenario, it could be a little bit more as well, but it does appear to work, is the limited point. But be that as it may, I just want to go back to Sanam, who's been listening in to all of this. Would you say, therefore, Sanam, and just going back to the point which you mentioned earlier on, and forget about just Indian students, because now even tourists and others can travel to the United Kingdom from India, the problem is going to arise if India goes back into the red list, right? And then nobody knows what's going to happen.
Absolutely, and there is a lot of concern around a potential third wave in India as well. And I know that there are many sort of experts who've said that we're looking at a third wave, maybe not as bad as, hopefully not as bad as the second wave, but that there could be an astronomical rise in the numbers of cases. And should that happen, does that mean that people who are planning today for travel in 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 4 weeks, however long that may be, will find that everything they've booked then suddenly changes, all the arrangements they've made then suddenly change. And so it's back to that point about communication, but also a larger point, Vishnu, which is we have more than 600,000 students from India that go abroad every year to study to the UK, to US, other countries. I have long questioned what more we can do to get the right return on investment, because India is spending
it is
billions
genuinely
of dollars annually.
It is so confusing. I'm just interrupting because completely out of time on this, but I want to end with just one more quote on the UAE situation. Etihad has said on its website, and I quote, this was yesterday's article, "A fully vaccinated national or resident of the UAE, you must have proof of having received both doses of the COVID-19 vaccine within the UAE no less than 14 days before travel." So if you're outside the country, you've been given Covishield or something else, you'll be wondering, what does this mean? Does this mean I can't go in? There is confusion. We leave it there. More coming up, including the latest on this new IPCC report. The implications are huge for people around the world with climate change. That's coming up. A new report by the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has really laid threadbare how close the globe is to being right on the edge. And by that, we're talking about climate change and the implications of what a 1.5 degree rise in global temperatures might actually imply for all of us. We are losing this battle at this stage. What exactly is at stake? Take a look.
Recent disasters across India, but scientists in a major climate change report by the UN say such incidents will occur more frequently. More heat waves, more droughts, melting glaciers, intense one-day rainfall, coastal flooding, more cyclones. The frequency and intensity of such disasters are not natural but human-made.
We'll see more compound events from sea level rise, so flooding. Even if we stop emitting right now or stop global warming at 1.5 degrees, we will see further retreat of glaciers, including in the Himalayas.
Why is this happening? The reason for such rapid climate change is human activity. It is producing massive amounts of heat-absorbing greenhouse gases or GHGs released by burning fossil fuels like coal and petroleum products, deforestation and agriculture. These greenhouse gases trap heat and warm the climate.
And unprecedented for the IPCC.
The report by the IPCC or Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, of which India is one of the 195 member nations, says global warming will exceed 1.5 degrees Celsius in the next 20 years. It is currently about 1.1 degrees, and the landmark 2015 Paris Climate Agreement had identified 1.5 degrees as the goal to limit warming. Globally, 1 in 10-year hot extreme events will occur 5 times more frequently at 2 degrees Celsius. At 4 degrees, these 1 in 10 events will likely happen 9.4 times in a 10-year period, nearly once a year on average. Ahead of the Glasgow Climate Conference later this year, the report is a key tool to get governments to step up their pledges to cut emissions, just like the last assessment report did for the Paris Conference. But as of now, several big countries have announced net zero targets by around 2050-2060, but India has pushed back on global pressure to do so. India says developed nations don't consider the rights of developing countries to economic growth. India wants the G20 countries to reduce per capita emissions. India is the third largest polluter but has one of the lowest per capita emissions, especially among large economies. So far, almost all pledges by governments fall short of the Paris Conference's target to keep warming ideally to 1.5 degrees. Now they are being called upon to make even more immediate, rapid and large-scale reductions in emissions.
Yeah, this is a very, very good point.
However, one of the report's authors says India should focus on alternative strategies, not a net zero.
India is supposed to reduce the emission intensity. On the net emissions, we are not asked to reduce immediately. But we improve our system so that we, per dollar of income, we emit less emissions. If you do waste management better, if you do like a vehicular management better, if you improve the thermal power plant, for thermal power plant also have the efficiency issue, right? You can improve the efficiency of thermal power plant.
This report has rung a lot of alarm bells, and that is why climate conferences, which usually see more blame games than action, are expected to deal with the crisis better this time. 195 IPCC member countries are going to decide the fate of 7 billion people and also of our future generations. In New Delhi with Chetan Bhattacharjee and camera person Rakesh Singh, this is Sukirti Dwivedi for NDTV.
Well, joining us now to look at the implications of that report, Alka Kelkar, Director of Climate at the World Resources Institute, India. We're also joined by Roxy Matthew Cole, a climate scientist at the Indian Institute of Tropical Meteorology. And I'm also joined by Arunabha Ghosh, Founder CEO of the Council on Energy, Environment and Water, and Professor Krishna Achyuta Rao, the Professor at the Center for Atmospheric Sciences at IIT Delhi. Thank you all very much for being with us. Roxy Matthew Cole, what are the implications of the world hitting a hike in terms of temperature of 1.5 degrees by 2030?
Well, the sixth assessment report that came out just today, it has some startling news for us. It says that the climate has changed forever in terms of human time scales. That is, some of the changes that we already see in terms of floods, droughts, cyclones are probably irreversible because the lifespan of carbon dioxide is quite long, and the oceans are absorbing the heat in a slow process over a long time. So the global mean temperature of 1.5 degrees Celsius limit will be met in the current decade or next, and the 2 degrees Celsius during 2040 to 2060 in the next subsequent decades. And this is because human-caused carbon dioxide emissions are increasing, and our current strategies of mitigation and adaptation are insufficient to stop it from changing further.
Okay. Alka Kelkar, sea levels are also rising. The average rate of seawater rise between 1901 and 1971 was 1.3 millimeters a year. Global mean sea level has increased by 0.20, in other words 0.15 to 0.25 meters between 1901 and 2018. In simple terms, what does this mean? In fact, just one more statistic. The rise in seawater levels has doubled to 3.7 millimeters a year between 2006-2018. So what happens if sea levels rise faster? Would it, other than flooding of low-lying areas, what are the other implications?
Thanks, Vishnu. I think sometimes when we say these numbers, they sound very small. I mean, what's a few degrees of warming to, those of us who live in India, or, what's a little bit of sea level rise to people living along the coast. But the problem with some of these smaller degrees of warming or smaller amounts of sea level rise is when you have the compounded risks that Roxy just spoke about. So, for example, when you have an incessant rainfall that continues over the period of 24 hours or more and coincides with periods of high tide, and at the same time we have a city which doesn't have adequate natural drainage that is designed for this once-in-century kind of event to happen every year almost, then what you have is a compounding of various kinds of hazards. And so that is really the problem that the IPCC report points out. It also warns us that its best estimate is 3 degrees Celsius. But we are moving towards a future when you have so much melting of the ice sheets in the Greenland and the Arctic that it could almost disrupt the ocean currents that moderate our climate system.
Right.
So it could also lead to more unprecedented and irreversible changes that we haven't thought of in the past.
Professor Achyutarao, another key point is that once in 10-year and once in 50-year events of extreme heat, heavy rain and droughts will be more frequent and more intense. Would you say that what we are seeing in terms of temperature rises in our own country, lots of droughts, exceptionally heavy rainfall, for example in parts of Maharashtra in the last couple of years, is linked to climate change, and that across the country we need to prepare for many more such events?
I think you're absolutely right. There's a fair warning that the monsoon is going to become not only stronger, but also more variable. That means that your high excess monsoons and the deficit monsoons are going to be more stark, and that in itself is going to be a problem. So your monsoons that you were kind of relying on to be the steady influx of rain and feeding the farmers and everybody is no longer going to be that moderating influence. It could be coming down heavier and more frequently varying on the negative in a deficit side. So this is indeed something that that is in the report as a warning, that these variations in the monsoon are going to get worse or more extreme. Similarly with heat waves and heavy rainfall events. What is compared in the report is how frequent these are compared to, let's say, sometime in the late 19th century when we didn't have as much human-induced climate change as we do now. So when you keep adding more and more carbon dioxide, you're just going to start loading the dice in terms of making these kinds of extreme events more and more frequent and more intense. So both droughts, heat waves, as well as heavy rainfall events are going to keep rising. And with each 0.1 degree of rainfall of warming that you will experience, these odds change. And as you go from 1.5 to 2 or even higher, heaven forbid, you will experience more and more of these extreme events.
Arunabha Ghosh, what is the implication of the increase in glacial melt in the Himalayas? How will your life and my life change over, say, the next 10 years?
Vishnu, as Roxy was also saying, look, we are now committed to over 1.5 degrees of warming, and that's going to rise more. Now, this will precipitate glacial melt in the Himalayas. It will precipitate Arctic sea ice melting, and this is the first thing we have to recognize, that our worries do not stop at our borders. What is happening far away geographically for us is still going to have an implication. Arctic melt will have an implication on what is happening in the tropics. So the intensity of glacial melt, the intensity of rainfalls, as Professor Achyutarao was talking about, all that will increase, but it will also result in severe damages to the built infrastructure. And this is where it is important to think about all of these issues beyond just the environmental dimension. India is a growing economy. We are going to put in more cement and concrete and hard infrastructure in the coming decades than what we have in the past, which means the economic damage from these extreme weather events. We've had 300 plus extreme weather events since 1990 alone, resulting in 5.6 lakh crore of damages for India alone. But the past is no longer going to be a predictor of the future. Your damages are going to actually increase as we develop. Because it's more of the damages to the hard infrastructure, more of the damages to lives and livelihoods that we'll have to quantify. So the biggest implication I would take away from this report is, please stop thinking about climate change as an issue for climate scientists and environmentalists. If we do not push this issue from the margins of our consciousness to the mainstream of our economic and political and social discourse, we're done for.
Wow. Alka, a rise in seawater temperatures and an increase in temperatures of seawaters would be devastating for coral, right? In our chains, the Lakshadweep chain, Andaman and Nicobar Island chain, the islands themselves will thereby become much more vulnerable. But the impact on marine species which so define these islands and some of our coastal areas and our shallow seas would be devastating as well. No one talks about this.
Certainly. I think it's very important to understand how sensitive some of these ecosystems are, but equally it is important to pay attention to how much we depend on these ecosystems for our livelihoods. So for example, you have farmers who grow paddy and rice, but the groundwater that is near the coast is going to get salt water intruded into it and become more salty, making that paddy difficult or unsuited for these future conditions. Same with fishermen, for example. Another very important tragedy that happened recently during Cyclone Tauktae was the Bombay High disaster, where a barge was caught in a severe storm. So our energy infrastructure is equally vulnerable to some of these changes in sea level and warming, as well as storms that we are seeing more and more around the world. I think even in Texas, for example, there was a cold weather storm that froze everybody's power lines and water lines. This was in February. Wildfires in California are actually causing the first climate bankruptcy. A business, P3G&E, went out of business because it was held liable for not taking adequate measures to underground the power sector lines that are vulnerable to wildfires. So I think more and more, even if we talk about ecosystems, nature, it is affecting every part of our lives, of our economy, and of the livelihoods that depend on this.
Yeah. Roxy, there does appear to be around the world a huge move towards electric transportation, electric cars, electric buses, much cleaner subway systems, metro systems. Now I know that brings the argument back to batteries. And are batteries made in an environmentally friendly manner? The answer is no, they are not. But leaving that aside for just a moment, by 2030, I suppose if all of us over here on this panel do drive cars at that stage and not rely on public transport exclusively, we would all be driving electric cars. Now, if this is going to happen around the world because there's been this shift in technology which has become acceptable, will our lives not get a little better and safer from an environmental standpoint?
Well, by cutting down all the emissions, the best thing we can attain is to stop these intense extreme events from accelerating further. So whatever changes that we are having right now will be here for centuries. That's the IPCC report, what it shows. But we can stop it from accelerating further. Stop the storms from accelerating, from intensifying further, stop the extreme rains from being widespread further. So that is the best thing we can achieve from that. But I have a different point to make, and that is that while curbing our emissions through electric vehicles and energy efficient methods, there is one part we are not focusing on. So what do we do when these extreme weather events happen? The only thing that India generally does is evacuate people. We depend on forecasts and early warning systems and evacuate people.
Yes.
But we cannot keep on evacuating people. We cannot wait for forecasts to happen. So a cyclone happens in the next 2-3 days. We ask the disaster management to be on ground and evacuate people. So occasionally lives are saved, but livelihoods, we have severe damage of property and infrastructure, and not only that, this happens in the cities, but in rural areas we have severe damage for agriculture, like what we saw in the recent Maharashtra floods, and it's now going on in UP. So what we need is a long-term solution, and what IPCC provides right now is more of a large-scale picture of how the climate is changing, extreme weather events are changing, but we need to go fine scale on it. We need to go on district level, because while climate change is global, the impacts and the challenges are local. Yeah. So we need to disaster-proof each and every district of India because their climate change challenges are unique.
Right. Professor Achyuta Rao, a last question to you. India, unfortunately, still relies very heavily on thermal energy. It just seems that as much as we try and grow our economy, we keep relying more and more or at the same level on thermal energy. There's the entire issue of efficiency associated with thermal energy plants. Is it your belief that unless India moves decisively away from thermal energy and decisively away from the argument that, look, we still pollute much less as a percentage than China or the United States, we're going to be stuck in the same trap, that we don't want to invest in new cleaner technology, and we justify that by saying, but you know, you guys are all bad, America, you polluted so much more, China, you polluted so much more, don't look at us. And that argument will get us nowhere.
I'm not a policy expert. I don't want to pretend to understand all the nuances that go into a government policy. But I will say this, as the IPCC has pointed out, this reduction in CO2 and other greenhouse gases is not negotiable. This is not something that one can sit back and say, I will sit this game out and I'll play it later.
Right.
This is something that is a global problem, and unless every country participates in this effort to reduce CO2 and other greenhouse gas emissions, we are not going to get there. Yeah. And the sad part is that whether or not we reduce emissions, it has to be a global collective effort, and only then will the CO2-driven climate change reduce. The climate doesn't care if the carbon dioxide comes from India or the US. What the climate does is take that CO2 and greenhouse gas, warm it up, and pump up your extremes and other disastrous events that we see unfolding already. So each additional molecule of CO2 that goes out, whether it has the Indian CO2 or the American CO2, the effect is going to be the same. Yep. So I think the policy-wise, it is important to look at this as a global commons issue and address it as such.
I have exactly 30 seconds left. Arunabha, you had a quick comment. Go ahead.
I just wanted to comment, Vishnu, on your point about efficiency of our power plants. And what we know at CW, we've just released the study that we can shut down 30 gigawatts of our coal power plants and make our electricity system actually more efficient if we drew power from more efficient power plants, and which save the power system over $1 billion annually. So while we are fixing the climate, we can also fix the economy if we just focused on the more efficient assets we have while we invest in the cleaner technologies of the future.
Right. Well, we seem to be endorsing a lot of nuclear energy as clean energy. I'm not sure that is necessarily the right step forward, but perhaps in the immediate run it meets our requirements. I'd like to thank you all very much for joining us and explaining to our viewers in such simple terms what we are staring at. This is a catastrophe, very much similar, in its dimension, perhaps even greater than what we've gone through with COVID. Time now for us to take this short break.